I'm an anthropologist. I did my PhD in the History of Consciousness program at UC Santa Cruz, which was a PhD program created by graduate students, basically to give themselves PhDs in things that there weren't PhD programs for. The program still has this legacy of trying to create space for doing work that feels needed but doesn't have a place for it. I was interested in what the university holds space for in its interdisciplinary work. That became an anthropology of science, which for me was doing an ethnography of how scientists make more scientists as a way of thinking about disciplining. One of my mentors, Sharon Trawick, had studied high energy physicists and how they create the idea of the eccentric genius in their students by picking up little things and amplifying them so that they could be more eccentric and they could have named eccentricities. So she helped me really hear how jokes and that anytime scientists were in the room with their graduate students, they were always mentoring them by sending them signals about what was appropriate to talk about and not appropriate to talk about in terms of kinds of physics, kinds of machines, kinds of topics. And then this goes all the way down to this last paper I've just been writing with Adrian Piper on how bullying happens in academic contexts. And it happens partly by what we're taught to be silent about when it's happening, like instead of intervening when someone's being put down, or when someone's way of approaching the world or scholarship or academia is being made fun of, even subtly, to recognize that's producing a future. How do we recognize that so that we can, in the moment, prevent it or stop it or interrupt it or shift, and then take more steps to figure out how we can make us more open space for people to explore the kinds of research that they want to do. I was caught in this trying to figure out like what discipline I want to be in from History of Consciousness. So I started going to lots of conferences, and I didn't know anything about performance or anything then. So I never went to a performance conference or performance studies conference, but I did go to like anthropology, history, sociology, communications, American studies. And it was more looking for which way of being did I like being among. And I love the way anthropologists would tell stories about something that happened in the field and then say, and here's a cool interpretation that I thought of. And the way you'd appreciate it is saying, oh, that's really cool. What about this? And they'd be like, oh, that's really cool too. Do you want to have a panel? Do you want to write a book together? So I just love that anthropology felt collaborative, partly because everyone felt lost, is my interpretation. And STS, Science Technology Studies, was another place where it felt like very open because everybody was in between different disciplines. I spent then a lot of time as a graduate student and junior professor trying to create spaces in these conferences for having alternate studies, pharmaceutical studies and science studies inside of anthropology and anthropology inside of science studies, because at the time there wasn't a lot of cross traffic. So we would hack the program to create little spaces in there for that kind of work. And that sometimes involved helping create journals or helping create subfields, because journals themselves can become these places that gatekeep what counts as scholarship for good reason. Most of those journals had become journals by creating space for themselves. So it's figuring out a way to care for the work that people have done to make their disciplines and why they feel like it's the space for their conversations. And at the same time, it often feels like they're exclusionary. So how can you, like, when you want to fit in, recognize that as what they're looking for? And then when you want to change things, how can you help create new spaces? Sometimes by editing a book or doing a special issue or something like that. And then the book is a way to sneak it, to create new conversations that then could become more subfields. The world shouldn't be divided up into disciplines. That's like a weird legacy of European thought and universities, and I think capitalism and racism in so many ways that prevents a type of reflexivity that would change the world by dividing it up into these like task-oriented disciplines. So disciplines often have blind side because they're so focused on answering certain types of problems. It's harder to bring in certain topics because they feel like they're outside of the issue. Kriti Sharma said so beautifully in her piece on biologists who are like reproducing a biology that's dependent on resources and scarcity, and themselves as biologists are in a world with grants that are dependent on resources and scarcity. And so it's, oh no, the biology I'm trying to do is actually mimicking the world that I don't like. This is the situation in which I found performance studies. What I like is that almost anything I'm curious about, and I'm usually curious alongside of other people, I can turn into an objective study that will somehow count as anthropology or science studies, or it won't count now and then 10 years later it'll count. I found performance studies through one of the PhD students here, Hilary Bryan, who was teaching a class called Embodying Space, which I thought was like a really cool title. And I was training in massage and hospice at the time because I could no longer be a historian. I got a history grant, which I thought would be my new field. And then the money was delayed. I had a whole summer that instead of spending in archives, I spent learning about bodies and dying. And then I had extra time, so I took this class on embodying space, and it changed my whole career, and I've never gone back to history. That was right when I came to Davis. I took Hilary's class and started learning about Laban movement analysis, and my son was training in tennis, and I was like having conversations with him. He was 10 years old, but like how he was learning about weight and how he was learning movement. And then with his coach, who had been a pro tennis coach, we were having lots of conversations about how mind and body affect each other, how the way you think about how your body moves changes how your body moves, and how the way you move changes how you think. And it was all wrapped up in this. I became really interested in these questions, and I started learning contact improvisation. I learned about it from Carl Frost and Nita Little. He was doing his MFA, and I joined his 10-week workshop, and I started talking with Nita Little every week for about 7 years as she finished her dissertation on contact improvisation. And I also started working with Kevin O'Connor and Jess Curtis, who were all here at the time, and then Mayfield Brooks. So all of them were doing dissertations and practices around contact improvisation. What was most important to me was that they were all approaching it as practice as research. Was something I'd never really thought about, was like how you can intentionally move with a floor, with others, with the environment as a form of learning how to think differently and how to move differently at the same time. So that to me was really interesting conceptually, because I'd always attended to how people spoke and how their speaking changed the world. And we'll talk about performativity in a little bit. But this was another loop inside of that issue, how the words that people were using was affecting and guiding the way they would practice, but their practice would wreck their concepts. Their practice would call into question the adequacy of the concepts that they were using. And that led them to have to create more concepts, change their concepts. So it was like affecting the way they thought. And then those new thoughts would create new possibilities for movement or exploration. And this helped me really think about how scientists were doing their work, because I was working with Natasha Myers at the time. I was working with some protein crystallographers here, and then with the Keck Caves with geologists here, and how they spent time visualizing geological 3D data in 3D, and how they used their hands and their concepts to think about the data, and then the data would pull their hands into a new configuration, and that would give them a new concept. So it was like this loop in which movement could teach thinking and thinking could teach movement. Nita would say your body is thinking, you have peripheral intelligence. And I liked the fact that from my research, this then changed the way people would write and think conceptually. And I started taking anatomy workshops. Gil Headley led these workshops. It was 3 weeks, 12 bodies, mostly 84-year-old people, and 48 body workers. So we were dissecting with regard to fascia, basically 12 bodies from the outside in, layer by layer, 3 days per layer. So 3 days just on skin, then 3 days on superficial fascia, and then 3 days on the muscle wrapping tissue. So it was amazing to both see the way in which vocabulary was wrong all the time, that bodies were so different from each other. And yet without the vocabulary of anatomy, we wouldn't be able to talk to each other. So I loved that the inadequacy of anatomy wasn't an ultimate problem. It was a kind of practical issue. We could orient each other to a bicep, even if the word bicep implied two heads, but some biceps had three and some had one. Because anatomy had always been this one thing that really seemed like a kind of very Western top-down assumption about how the body worked. And so even within that, it was great to do a deep dive into how much anatomists disagreed with each other. And then what I loved was learning this kind of practice as research through Gil Hedley, like feeling the fascia under the skin by actually doing dissections. I started taking some stuff with Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen on body-mind centering, and she had been leading for 40 years an experiential anatomy approach where you read medical textbooks and anatomy textbooks, and then you try to experience what you think you just read. And just by trying to move with the thing that you think you read about, you start to ask many more new and interesting questions about the text. And the text in turn suggests new ways to move. Body-mind centering didn't accrete into this is how the body works. Instead, it's become, from my perspective, and working with Bonnie, just directly how to research your body again and again. It helps me notice the learning that's happening with all scientists. And that's made me a much better interviewer, because I can like tap into that joy that they have where they're at the edge of their body teaching them how the microscope works, and the microscope's teaching them how to see, and the seeing is teaching them about lichen, and the lichen is teaching them about their bodies. I was able to work with these contact improvisers who had this amazing research, intellectual, practical practice, but were struggling to put it onto words. And I was like, oh, I can help with that. And along the way, I learned about contact improvisation and a little bit of performance studies, and really about interdisciplinary research. I just started co-authoring as many things as possible because it was really exciting to think with others and to mash up our vocabularies. So it's very ecumenical. Performativity is a term that in science and technology studies came out of lots of different researchers, but there were some like Michel Colon and some other names here who were interested in how a theory of the market then led people to create an institution that enacted that theory. So he created a marketplace that acted as if the theory was correct. And then by creating it, the theory then became the way the market works. And that could lead to all sorts of consequences down the road. It could be exploited in different ways, but the theory became real, right? It became made into objects or embedded into objects. And they talked about that as performative. And I connect that to Austin's performative utterance. When a policeman says stop, it means something different than when your friend says stop, because there's different consequences to those actions. Judith Butler's talking about performing gender in different ways, that like we're always inside of systems in which what we do has signed consequences. Others read what we do as a kind of semiotic way as participating in categories. Whether we intended it or not, those categories are like swirling about us because they're embedded in the sociality and the institutions that are around us. So you can't help but perform gender. You can't help but perform citizenship. You can't help but do these things because there's institutions that operate with, they put binaries into practice. So if we think of performativity as like theories made into institutions that become laws, that's a form of performativity. This is the kind that I worked with. Because of what neuroscientists thought humans were like, they then looked for those things in brain images and in clinical trials, and then they made brain images that had labels like, or women, men, or schizophrenia, normal. And then those images with those labels then get applied to people in courtrooms, and people see those images and think that it says something about themselves. Like a brain image with male and female underneath it reinforces the idea that male and female are really existing biological things, and people do things with that realism. So for me, that loop in which we encounter things that look like facts to us and then incorporate them into our life so that they shape the way we behave and the way we speak is part of this loop of performativity. Ian Hacking, who just died this last week, was a philosopher who, among other things, talked about this looping theory, in which categories get instantiated into social and political and economic institutions that then run our lives until we challenge them, break them, open them, multiply them. For me, it just means I'm always listening to the combination of what we say, what we do, and how those loop through our institutions and our social practices. So as an anthropologist, I'm listening to how people talk. My bias is with this idea of practice as research. I've always thought of this as a program where doing things, whether it's in a studio or in the world as an activist or street performer or someone making installation art, that's also research, and recognizing that research and figuring out a way to recognize it as research, as a way of changing or widening what research is in the world. So how do we create a program that can support that, and explicitly around things that have a kind of history in the arts? I'm wide open as to what counts as art, from dance to ceramics to theater to singing and sound making and performative drawing. I don't know what else we have in this program right now. Lots of different projects don't fit any other discipline, and they involve a discipline here in the other sense of sustained practice of making. And so I see our program in performance studies as in a kind of interesting dialogue with performance studies more widely. I'm not sure how many programs there are in the US that support practices research in this sense. There's a bunch of journals called performance studies. Some of them are in relation to performance as a kind of proscenium or stage-based or installation-based art scene that are more part of what could be called a art world marketplace, or less formal than a marketplace. One of the things I think that makes our program stand out or special or different from other programs is that we've really tended to encourage people who have long-standing art practices, 10 or more years, to come and do practices research, either as a reflection on their career or as a continuation of their career, but now with the added reflexivity of finding ways to write about it. And I'm thinking writing, broadly speaking, too. Lots of things count as writing, but in dialogue with academic writing about performance, about art, about performativity, and so on. If you don't want to write at all, this will be a painful program for you, but you don't have to only write. So I think we're still trying to invent what practices research looks like in a dissertation form. There's a bunch of European programs that do practices research, and they are like actively training in performance and art making and practice. We don't support making new work in the sense of giving you theater equipment or research equipment or other things. You have to be pretty scrappy to actually make stuff here. If you want to do stuff, you can, but we don't have the resources. You can do practices research here, but you have to figure it out. But we can help you get grants. So you need to, it's a bootstrapping process. That's been good because most of the people that come here really want to be here, and there's no other place that they could really be because they are doing things that are hybrid in a way that other PhD programs don't support. The good thing is, in general, we fund you for 5 years, which means we allow you to TA for relatively little money, but in response, you get all your tuition paid and you get a barely livable, on edge of livable salary for that, which is better than going into debt. So compared to programs where you actually pay to go, we're well-funded. Compared to programs that fully wrap you and cuddle you and give you free housing, we're terrible. So that's my selling of the program. The other amazing thing about our program is we have what it is 60 plus faculty who are associated with performance studies. We are a graduate group at the moment here at UC Davis. That means we're a free-floating graduate program in which all of the faculty have home bases in other departments and are all, in a sense, volunteering in because they love performance studies. So they want to be here when they're here. And it means there are faculty in, I don't know what, like 20 different programs. All of the arts and humanities disciplines have faculty that are part of performance studies that you can work with. So there is a huge wide range of faculty who you can connect to. You have to do the work though. They will not necessarily come find you. And we have a lot of designated emphases, which are like graduate minors. So you can take 5 classes in Native American studies and do, in a sense, a kind of master's in Native American studies, or in STS, science and technology studies, or critical theory, or feminist, gender and women's studies, religious studies, and so on. And you can do more than one of those. Sometimes people do up to 3. So it's a way to, our program requirements are relatively light in terms of actual classes you have to take, because mostly we expect you to be developing relationships with faculty and diving deep with them so that you can really follow out your research interest in a way that makes you legible to scholars across the academy. And then you can choose some of these programs to do deep dives in, and usually that comes with being able to teach for those programs. So you'll get a lot of experience in teaching for those programs, and some of our alumni then go on and get jobs in those other programs. Some go on and to become artists again, or they've never stopped being artists. So there's lots of paths, and everyone will change while they're here, but we try to support whatever path you're aiming at. Coming out of the pandemic, we were trying to do some of these retreats to actually think as a program what we want practice as research to look like. I think we're still inventing what dissertations can look like, how to balance types of scholarly writing, reflective writing, things that look like practice manuals, guides, handbooks, and things that look like art pieces in different ways, or documentation of art pieces, depending on what the art is. I'm interested in figuring out both how to have it open-ended or ambiguous in our requirements, as much as that's not helpful to some people, because I'd rather have it not restricted, and then encourage students and faculty working with students to write contracts that could be revised, that outline what's being expected of what their work looks like. Just as a practice that might help everyone have less, each individual dyad then, or each student would have a clear sense of what they need to be doing. Something where we structure a little bit more what you think you're up to at the moment, and you agree with some other people, this is what I'm up to, and they agree. This is an important conversation to stabilize more often than not, especially in our program where all the faculty are somewhere else. So they all have different expectations about what's wanted. Finding ways to make those conversations more explicit would be great. And I think when you're joining the class, if you say, I'm an artist, I'm really interested in learning this class, I'll do the weekly presses, but I'd like to make my final project this, then the faculty member has the chance to agree or disagree at that moment before you're halfway through. How can we try to be more explicit in our relationships? I'm excited about this because I think artists, performers have so much to teach. Like, many faculty are just afraid, like they're afraid of poetry. I'm still afraid of poetry. If someone gives me a poem as a final project, or if I'm supposed to somehow grade a poem, I have no idea what to do. Now I've been working with poets for the last couple of years, and I'm starting to learn how to give feedback and how to ask questions, but I needed to learn. And we're in a system that my mentoring includes at least anticipating how others might judge something. As a program, we have a lot to teach each other, and it's just more about figuring out how to arrange it so it doesn't feel like labor, but it feels like changing the world. If we can change how disciplines work by co-teaching each other how to do things, that might be one way of changing what classes and PhDs look like within the broad institutional rules, so we don't have to fight the institution. When you have faculty in different disciplines, the expectations can be super different for that. We've tried with having a main advisor. Everyone should be meeting with their main advisor at least once a quarter for at least a couple hours to check in, but ideally once a month, once every 2 weeks, more. Some students in our program come in and they're already in their 60s with a huge career behind them, and others come in almost right out of undergrad. So totally different mentoring expectations and sense of what they want. Sitting down and saying, what are your expectations? What are my expectations? And especially, how do you work? Finding ways to have these conversations, which aren't always comfortable. Go set aside a meeting to meet with your advisor and maybe your second and third advisors maybe separately, maybe together, and say, what kind of mentoring are you looking for? What kind of mentoring do they want to give you? Where are you aiming at that point? Because 6 years is not long for a PhD, but it's a long time in your life. People's ideas of what they want to do change drastically. It's expected that the dissertation you come in with may not be the one you leave with. As it changes, you may want to work with different people, or you may want to change the expectations of how often you meet or how often you get feedback on things. It's a self-starting program because all the faculty's attention is mostly directed toward their disciplines because that's their pull. So we need to be more active in those respects. My academic life has been a constant series of experiments in collaboration. Early on, two of my friends created a writing group that they thought would be one shot. And now 11 of us have been meeting for over 14 years, once a year for 3 days, in which we pre-share work in progress and everybody commits to reading it. And then everybody gets 1 hour during those 3 days where everybody talks about their work in front of them and they don't talk. And that practice is so generative. Just hearing smart people talk about your work and you not being able to talk back and you can't tell them they're wrong, that has led people over these years to write, in some cases, 2 or 3 books. It's 1 chapter a year, but 6 years is a book. It sounds like just 3 days a year, and yet it's a super supportive community and we don't really talk that much outside of it. And originally we just met before or after a conference that we got all arranged to go to pool the money as graduate students or young professors and have that much money. So we just piggybacked it on a trip and made a little retreat out of it. But that's one kind of collaborative form. Another has been just finding ways to co-author or to co-do a project with someone who I really like thinking with. Because in the beginning, I thought I should work with people who were working on the same topic as me, but it turned out we could really geek out about the topic, but I didn't always like thinking with them. So when I found people who I really liked thinking with, then I made it more of a project to try to teach with them, try to do a project together, do a grant with them, or write with them, because then when I was doing my academic work, I was with the people I wanted to be with. And then to think with, that worked out really well. Otherwise, it felt like there was this conflict between people I really like thinking with, but I was writing with these other people. Figuring that out took a while and take me in directions that I didn't expect to go in. If you look at the things I write, though, they are really weird, really wide set of projects, but that's because I'm following people more than I'm following the project. I'm more willing to send things in and get feedback from peer review, that things aren't as precious as they were when I first started, where I'd get crushed with a bad review. Then I realized, well, yeah, people really have different opinions, and bad reviews are actually really helpful for me sorting out the world. Maybe this subfield isn't for me. Maybe if I aimed it at this other one that seemed to what I was doing, I could get it published. And then maybe when I'm on panels, I'm with those people instead of these other people. So for me, a lot of interdisciplinarity is exploring enough to know that there's other options and that there's so much weird, cool stuff out there. Once you find those little niches, then you can really enjoy the thought and the publishing tactics that happen there and the kinds of conferences people have. In the beginning, I do tons of talks where you go there and you read and you present a bunch of slides. Now I really like trying to do workshops, like a smaller audience, but longer time, in which you can really think with people rather than talk at them and have them perform questions back to you. That it doesn't have the same consumption feel. We're going to spend this time together. Why are we here? What do we want to do with it? What do we want out of it? And my writing has become more of that mode. Everything I've written has always been rejected about 2 times, maybe more. I feel like I'm slow but persistent, and stuff gets through because it finds its audience. Regularly sending stuff out helps you find those audiences better than trying to get it perfect and then sending it out. Because if you try to get it really perfect and send it out and it gets rejected, then you feel like really crushed. Plus, you're not sending much stuff out. So it's the general encouragement to like take writing seriously but lighter, more persistently. It may be that you actually then find the audiences that want to find you. It's like, how do you meet people? This is my last bit of advice. Go to lots of conferences. If you can afford it, sneak in, whatever. And if you're presenting at a conference, make sure your title, especially, and then your abstract, they are your advertisement. They are the chance that someone who wants to meet you and that you really want to meet, but neither of you know each other yet. And then you could meet people who you actually like thinking with. So write those so that they're the you that you want to be found. If you perform someone who you think you should be, but you don't actually want to be that person, and then people find you and they expect that person, and then you have to be that person, you can be really trapped in a type of professionalism that isn't as happy as it could be. If I go to a conference and there's 9,000 people there and I meet one person who I love thinking with and they love thinking with me, if I do that twice a year, after 20 years, I have 40 people. That's enough. You don't need that many people.